Jimmy Page is 82 years old, and though he has not released an album since 1988, Forbes magazine has just ranked him the greatest rock guitarist who ever lived. He spent 50 years protecting one secret. His bandmates never spoke of it. His managers buried it. And now at 82 years old, with nothing left to lose, Jimmy Page has finally let it out, and what he just revealed has shaken the entire music world. And once you hear it, you will never listen to Led Zeppelin the same way again. The man at 81. On the 9th of January, 2025, Jimmy Page turned 81 years old, has received the Officer of the Order of the British Empire for charity work in Brazil, received a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award with Led Zeppelin, received honorary doctorates from the University of Surrey and from Berklee College of Music in Boston, received the United Nations Award for Peace in 2010, was honored by President Obama at the Kennedy Center in December 2012, became an honorary citizen of Rio de Janeiro, and was named by Forbes magazine as a defining architect of Led Zeppelin, the greatest rock band of all time. Inside Tower House, the archive page has spent 50 years assembling contains the original master tapes from the Led Zeppelin recording sessions, instruments from every period of his career, original artwork, documents, photographs, and a body of unreleased material whose full extent is known only to him. In 2024, his official social media accounts discussed the Coverdale/Page album from 1993 and hinted at a possible expanded release, including a previously unheard track called Saccharine. His collaborator, David Coverdale, had discussed a box set of the same album as far back as 2018 without it ever materializing, and whether this represents a new creative project or an archival impulse is not yet clear. I am never not doing something, and I am never not doing something that is going to surprise people, he told Classic Rock magazine in 2020, and he was not being vague. In the same interview, he addressed the question of regrets. Regrets can grow into resentments, and I try not to hold resentments. The thing that I have found is that if you come up against an obstacle, then I can think of numerous ways of getting around it, and whether that is musically or not, I think it is good to be able to think in a more positive way than a negative way. His family history spans 6 decades in several countries. His daughter, Scarlett Page, born in 1971 to French model Charlotte Martin, became a professional photographer. His son, James Patrick Page III, was born in April 1988 to his first wife, Patricia, a model he met while she was working as a waitress in New Orleans during the firm's American tour, and they married in December 1986 and divorced in 1995. His 2 daughters, Sophia Jade and Ashen Jazan, were born to his second wife, Jimena Gomez Paracha, whom he met during the No Quarter Tour in 1994, and Jimena founded the Action for Brazil's Children Trust in 1998, the charity that earned Page his OB. And then there is Scarlett Sabet, who is 35 years old and has been with Page for nearly a decade inside Tower House. She shares a first name with his eldest daughter, a coincidence the tabloids have noted repeatedly, and in a 2020 interview with Tatler magazine, sitting inside the very house Page refused to let David Bowie buy, Sabet described the age gap. It is funny because on paper there's a massive difference, but when he is standing in front of me, it is not something I feel. It is not something that impedes us. Page has been sober for a number of years, and Sabet frames this not as a constraint, but as a shared value. The man who once consumed substances at the kind of scale that should have ended careers and lives now cooks meals in a kitchen in Holland Park and makes his partner laugh more than anyone else does. The legacy requires no further additions to be complete. Led Zeppelin 4 alone has sold over 37 million copies. A band that dissolved in December 1980 still outsells a majority of active artists working today. And the man who designed every aspect of that machine, from the guitar sounds to the album artwork to the occult symbols pressed into vinyl to the record label to the touring percentages that permanently rewrote the industry's rules, is alive, sober, productive, and sitting in the most extraordinary house in Holland Park, surrounded by everything he ever made and by every available indication, still not finished making things. Bob Spitz, who spent years researching the most detailed biography ever written about Led Zeppelin, concluded that what Page built was not just music, but method, and methods, unlike careers, do not simply end. But none of this makes sense unless you know where it started. And it started in a house in Surrey in 1956 when the band and guitar that nobody claimed and a 12-year-old boy who decided very quietly that it belonged to him. A boy, a guitar, and a destiny. Here is something that almost nobody talks about when they talk about Jimmy Page. Right now, Jimmy Page is living in a Victorian Gothic mansion in Holland Park, London, that he bought in 1972 specifically because David Bowie wanted it, and Jimmy Page simply refused to let him have it. He outbid Bowie, he won, he moved in, and he has been inside the house with its medieval painted ceilings and its stained glass windows, and its walls lined with original Led Zeppelin master tapes ever since. The house is called Tower House. It was designed in 1875 by the Victorian architect William Burgess, who built it as a monument to his own obsessions, and every room is a different world. The ceilings are painted gold. The fireplaces are carved with mythological figures. There are stained glass windows so intricate that they took craftsmen years to complete. And inside all this extraordinary Victorian architecture, Jimmy Page has been sitting quietly for over 50 years, tending an archive and doing things the world mostly does not hear about. One of those things started in late 2013. Page walked into the World's End bookshop on the King's Road in Chelsea and attended a poetry reading. The poet was a young woman named Scarlett Sabet. She was 24 years old, of Iranian and Scottish-French descent, and she had just self-published her first collection of poems. Page sat in the audience and watched her perform, and he described what happened in a later interview with Interview magazine, saying, and these are his exact words, "The whole place hushed." After the reading, he waited, he approached her, and they became friends first. In August 2014, they began a relationship, and when the tabloids found out in January 2015, the reaction was almost comically predictable. Every newspaper in Britain ran the age gap calculation. He was 71, she was 25, and the coverage was so intense that Page had to hire private security to escort Sabet to her job at the Chelsea Arts Club. In a 2020 interview with Tatler magazine conducted inside Tower House itself, Sabet described the moment. At the time, it felt very uncomfortable. I felt like my life was going to be over. I had such a sense of shame about the whole thing. And yet, the relationship did not collapse under the weight of the attention. It deepened. By 2019, Page had produced a spoken word album for Sabet, recorded in the basement studio of Tower House, called Catalyst, and in the same Tatler interview, Sabet offered a description of Page that has appeared in almost no coverage of him across 5 decades. She said, "He is not just my partner. He is my best friend, and the person who makes me laugh the most. He does not drink. He has seen all sides of that coin. He has lost best friends. And now the man the world thinks it knows everything about lives quietly inside his extraordinary house in Holland Park, with no large gatherings, his children visiting, and their life by all accounts strikingly ordinary and genuinely happy." But to understand why Forbes made that call and to understand the full weight of what Jimmy Page actually built, you have to go back to a house in Surrey in 1956, to an abandoned guitar that nobody came to claim, and to a 12-year-old boy who decided very quietly that it belonged to him. The guitar was a campfire-style acoustic with a round hole, the kind teenagers use for skiffle music. It had been left behind the house that the Page family moved into on Miles Road in Epsom, Surrey. Nobody came to collect it. Nobody explained why it was there, and James Patrick Page, born on January 9th, 1944 in Heston, Middlesex, picked it up and would not put it down for the rest of his life. What is important to understand about the way Jimmy Page learned to play is that he learned it almost entirely alone. He took a few lessons in Kingston. He rejected formal instruction immediately, and he later told Guitar Player magazine, "I got bored, so I learned by listening to records." It became a very personal journey for me. The records he was listening to were remarkable for a Surrey schoolboy in the mid-1950s. Scotty Moore, the guitarist on Elvis Presley's Son record sessions, whom Page later called monumental. Cliff Gallup, who played for Gene Vincent and his Blue Caps. Elmore James and B.B. King, deep in the American blues tradition. And Lonnie Donegan, the British skiffle pioneer whose raw percussive approach hit Page like an electric shock and made him believe that making music was something he could actually do. In 1957, at the age of 13, Page appeared on BBC One on a program called All Your Own. His skiffle group performed Mama, Don't Allow No Skiffle Anymore, and a lead belly cover. And when the host asked the boy on camera what he wanted to do with his life, Page said he wanted to do biological research to find a cure for cancer, then added with complete sincerity that he was not sure he had enough brains for that. 3 years later, he left school at 15 after a confrontation with the school's deputy head, who had been openly scathing about his musical ambitions. He left with 4 O-levels and never looked back. At Ewell County Secondary School, a slightly older student named Rod Wyatt had taught Page his first proper chords, together with a third boy named Pete Calvert. The group practiced at Jimmy's house. Page brought his guitar to school every single day. The teachers confiscated it during class time and returned it at the end of lessons, and Page waited at that bell like a man waiting for a sentence to end. The teenager who left school with a guitar and 4 O-levels was about to take a detour through illness and art college that would entirely by accident turn him into the most recorded session guitarist in the history of British popular music. After leaving school, Page joined Neil Christian's touring band called the Crusaders, playing Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis covers around England. The pace was punishing, and after nearly 2 years of constant travel and bad accommodation, his body gave out completely. He contracted glandular fever, the kind that comes back every 2 months and drains a person to the point of near collapse. So he stopped touring and enrolled at Sutton Art College in Surrey to recover. Page kept playing through his illness, and on Thursday evenings he performed with the Interval Band at the Marquee Club on Oxford Street in London. Night after night, he stood in the same room as Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, and Ginger Baker, all of them young, all of them hungry, all of them competing over who could play what. Page was noticed. A man named John Gibb caught one of his performances and asked him to record, and shortly afterward, Mike Leander at Decca Records offered him regular studio work. His first Decca session, recorded on the 2nd of January, 1963, was a track called Diamonds by Jet Harris and Tony Meehan. It reached number 1 on the UK singles chart within weeks, and Page was 19 years old. What followed was one of the most remarkable parallel careers in rock history. A young man playing on the records that defined a generation while remaining almost entirely uncredited. In studios, he was known as Little Jim P, to distinguish him from Big Jim Sullivan, the other dominant session guitarist of the era, and together the two of them formed a guitar insurance system for the entire London music industry. If you needed a guitarist, you called one of them. The list of recordings Page appeared on between 1963 and 1966 is almost impossible to absorb. He played rhythm guitar on whose debut single, I Can't Explain. He played acoustic 12-string on 2 tracks of the Kinks' debut album. He appeared on Marianne Faithfull's As Tears Go By. He appeared beneath John Barry's orchestral arrangement on Shirley Bassey's Goldfinger for the James Bond film. And he appeared on sessions for Donovan, Joe Cocker, David Bowie's early Manish Boys recordings, Petula Clark, Tom Jones, and Cliff Richard. One industry estimate places Page on approximately 60% of all recordings that reached the UK top 10 between 1963 and 1965. I remember him having a reputation almost before I turned professional. I think he was the youngest session musician until I came along. We were always really glad to see each other on the sessions because it meant that you had a young hip rhythm section, recalled one contemporary. My session work was invaluable. At one point, I was playing at least 3 sessions a day, 6 days a week, and I rarely ever knew in advance what I was going to be playing. I finally called it quits after I started getting calls to do music. I decided I could not live that life anymore. 1 week after he quit, the Yardbirds called. He had spent 5 years being the most important musician that nobody had heard of, and what came next would make sure that nobody could ever ignore him again. Eric Clapton left the Yardbirds in 1964. Page was the first call. He said no out of loyalty to Clapton, and when Clapton officially departed in 1965 and Page was offered the slot a second time, he said no again and recommended his childhood friend Jeff Beck instead. Page was watching from the outside, learning, waiting. Then in 1966, a recording session in London changed everything permanently. Page, Beck, John Paul Jones on bass, Keith Moon on drums, and Nicky Hopkins on piano walked into Advision Sound Studios in May 1966 and recorded a track called Beck's Bolero, written by Page. The session sparked a serious conversation about forming a supergroup with Page, Beck, Moon, and John Entwistle from The Who. They needed a vocalist. Contractual barriers prevented it from moving forward, but something important was said in the conversation about whether it could work at all. Keith Moon suggested the project would go over like a lead balloon. John Entwistle's version was more specific, like a Led Zeppelin. The phrase stayed in Page's mind. Page formally joined the Yardbirds in 1966, replacing Paul Samwell Smith. then moving to twin lead guitar alongside Beck. For a few months, the band contained both of them, which has since become one of rock history's most discussed what-ifs. Beck left in October 1966. Page took over as sole lead guitarist. Their 1967 album Little Games failed commercially, but their live performances became something else entirely. Long, experimental, increasingly improvised, and Page pushed the live set into territory the studio records never touched, using a cello bow drawn across the electric guitar strings to produce textures nobody in rock had attempted before. These performances were the direct foundation of what Led Zeppelin would become on stage. When Drage and McCartney left in 1968, Page was left with the band's name, unfinished tour dates, and a clear vision. His first choice for vocalist was Terry Reid, who declined because he had just signed a solo deal. Reid made a recommendation that stands as one of the most consequential suggestions in rock history. He told Page to find a young singer in the Midlands named Robert Plant. Page tracked Plant down to a performance at a teacher's training college in Walsall on the 20th of July, 1968, where Plant was fronting a group to an audience of almost nobody. The singer was impossible to ignore from the first moment. After the show, Page told Plant simply, "I think we should get together. If you are interested, come down and spend some time at my place." Plant recruited John Bonham, his friend from the Midlands. Bonham was genuinely hard convinced and had multiple other offers on the table, and his wife Pat was reportedly skeptical about Plant's ability to deliver on his promises, which made the recruitment more complicated than Page had expected. Page watched Bonham play live at a Tim Rose concert on the 31st of July, 1968, and described his reaction in the simplest possible terms. "I had never seen anyone quite like Bonzo. That was it. I knew that he was going to be perfect." John Paul Jones completed the lineup by contacting Page directly, prompted by his wife, who had spotted a newspaper article about Page's plans. Jones was making excellent money on the session circuit, but had stopped enjoying it entirely, and told Page he was available if Page needed a bass player, and Page said yes without hesitation. The four men played together for the first time in a room beneath a record store on Gerrard Street in London in August 1968. Manager Peter Grant changed the spelling from Lead Zeppelin to Led Zeppelin to prevent radio DJs from mispronouncing it, and by December 1968, they were playing their first dates in the United States. The machine was running. Four musicians had found each other in a basement in Soho in a single afternoon and were about to build the most commercially dominant rock band the world had ever seen. But the empire Jimmy Page constructed would demand something from every person inside it and eventually take the one thing that could not be replaced. Led Zeppelin's commercial dominance was not accidental. It was architected. All 9 studio albums reached the top 10 on the United States Billboard chart. 6 reached number 1. 8 consecutive albums reached number 1 in the United Kingdom. They sold somewhere between 200 and 300 million records worldwide. 5 albums achieved diamond certification, among the rarest designations in recording history. Led Zeppelin 4 alone has sold over 37 million copies, and Stairway to Heaven was never released as a commercial single, and yet became the most requested and most played song on American rock radio throughout the entire 1970s. Ahmet Ertegun, the Atlantic Records chairman who signed them and watched them for decades from the closest possible distance, eventually said this about Page: "He is the least conventional, the most personal. He developed a magical, distinctive style." In 1974, at the absolute peak of their commercial power, Led Zeppelin launched their own record label. Swan Song Records gave the band total creative and financial control over everything: their releases, their artwork, their release schedules, and the artists they chose to sign. Manager Peter Grant had negotiated a touring deal where Led Zeppelin received 90% of concert gate receipts, a figure so far above the industry standard that it permanently reshuffled the power balance between artists and promoters across the entire music industry. The machine they built was total. I do not regret it at all, because when I needed to be really focused, I was really focused. Both Presents and In Through the Outdoor were only recorded in 3 weeks. That is really going some. You've got to be on top of it. Page told Q magazine in 2003 about his substance use during this period, with a direct clarity that only comes from surviving something completely. In 1977, while the band was playing stadiums across America, Robert Plant's 5-year-old son, Carrick, died suddenly at home in England. The remaining tour dates were canceled immediately, Led Zeppelin did not return the road for 2 years, and Plant was never quite the same person after that summer. On the 25th of September, 1980, John Bonham was found dead at Page's rented house in Windsor, Berkshire. He consumed the equivalent of approximately 40 shots of vodka over the course of a single day, and his body asphyxiated during sleep. He was 32 years old. Page described the aftermath to People magazine. "I could not even look at my guitar, because it was part and parcel of the band. I had made such a major statement being in a group like Zeppelin. It is the best of my playing, and one could never eclipse that." Led Zeppelin formally dissolved in December 1980. The empire was gone, and what remained was a man who built it and a private life that the world was about to examine more harshly than anything he had faced before. Page did not perform publicly for approximately 2 years after Bonham's death. To understand the full weight of what he carried through all his public years, you need to understand something he has almost never discussed openly. Page found Aleister Crowley at the age of 15, reading alone at home in Surrey, and his reaction was not disturbed. It was illuminated. By 1970, he had opened his own occult bookshop on Kensington High Street and purchased Boleskine House on the southern shore of Loch Ness, a crumbling Highland mansion that Crowley himself had bought in 1899 to perform a 6-month ceremonial magical operation. Crowley left before completing it. The demons he summoned had never been properly dismissed, and the house's history was already dark before Crowley arrived. It sat above the ruins of a church that local tradition held had burned to the ground during a service, killing the entire congregation inside. A previous owner had shot himself in what became Crowley's bedroom, and the caretaker Page appointed reported objects moving, doors slamming without cause, and a house guest who awoke screaming she had been attacked in her sleep. A man was beheaded there, and sometimes you can hear his head rolling down. Of course, after Crowley, there have been self-harms. People carted off to mental hospitals. Page delivered that description to Rolling Stone magazine in 1975 with characteristic deadpan composure, in a tone that made it impossible to tell whether he was warning the interviewer or simply reporting facts. The fourth Led Zeppelin album, released in 1971 with no title and no artist name on the sleeve, contained Page's most deliberate act of occult encoding, identified solely by 4 symbols. Page's own symbol, which he called Zoso, originated in a 1557 alchemical grimoire, where it represented the planet Saturn, and the inner sleeve image of an old man bent beneath a heavy burden was a reworking of the hermit card from the tarot, chosen personally by Page. Every detail was an instruction to those who knew how to read it. The most serious and most enduring controversy of Page's life concerns a young American girl named Lori Maddox. In multiple published interviews, Maddox has described being 14 years old when a member of Led Zeppelin's management brought her to Page's hotel suite in Los Angeles. Page was 28. The relationship continued for approximately a year. He worked to keep it private, and Page has never publicly addressed this episode directly. The Me Too movement returned sustained attention to it from 2017 onward, and his silence on the matter has been interpreted in sharply different ways by different people. Page formed the firm with Paul Rogers of Bad Company. Their 1985 debut reached number 17 on the Billboard chart and went gold in the United States. The central tension of his post-Zeppelin career remained his relationship with Robert Plant. Their 1994 MTV Unplugged special drew the network's highest ever ratings. The 1998 album Walking Into Clarksdale won the Grammy for Best Hard Rock Performance, and John Paul Jones, excluded from the reunion without explanation, made his feelings known at the 1995 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction. "Thank you, my friends, for finally remembering my phone number." The defining event of Page's post-Zeppelin public life was the December 10th, 2007 reunion concert at London's O2 Arena, staged as a tribute to Ahmet Ertegun, who had died in 2006. Led Zeppelin performed with Jason Bonham on drums. The demand for tickets produced 20 million requests for approximately 18,000 available seats, a world record for a single music event that still stands. The concert was filmed and released as Celebration Day and won the Grammy for Best Rock Album in 2013 in Backstage. Page pushed for a full world tour while Plant declined. It was the last time they performed together as Led Zeppelin. And that single night tells you everything about Jimmy Page's legacy. He was not chasing nostalgia. He was not there for money. He wanted to prove one final time that what they built together was still the most powerful thing in any room on Earth. The crowd of 18,000 people who got inside that arena that night will spend the rest of their lives telling people they were there. 20 million others will always wonder what would have felt like. Drop your thoughts in the comments below and tell us what you think the man still has left to give the world.